First thing I want to do is say thanks to Bruce for hosting this conversation. I think it's a really, really important one. This is a topic, the UFO phenomenon, that is full of so much misinformation and disinformation, so much fear in people of social ostracism and rejection. So I think it's really great that we're having this conversation to start to bring some nuance and complexity and some thoughtfulness into a conversation that's often filled with a lot of emotional reactivity and dissonance and noise and chaos. So thanks to Bruce for hosting this. My contribution is going to be framed around the topic of weird naturalism and its relationship to this phenomenon. In a previous version of Integral Stage, the topic was on sacred naturalism. I offered some reflections on a growing body of thought that's sometimes called weird naturalism or weird realism or supernaturalism or the supernormal. And the fuller version of those kind of thoughts is in that video, so if people are interested, they might want to check that one out. I'll just do a very, very brief summary. I don't really want to rehash all that terrain in this one, but some basic, very primer kind of thoughts on what weird naturalism is, and then start applying it to the UFO phenomenon. And I think a lot of really interesting things start emerging when we do that. And then concluding, I'm going to talk about what the implications of bringing this framework to bear on this topic might be for people who have or are having, have had or are having experiences of an anomalous nature, and how this framework can be supportive in terms of healing and transformational journeys. So we're going to cover a lot of fascinating terrain. So here we go. So weird naturalism in super brief summary version. These topics, the UFO, but what's broadly termed the paranormal, high strange, the anomalous, mystical, numinous, etc. Typically, the conversation around these dynamics is dominated by sort of two schools of thought that spend all their time kind of warring with each other. So on the one hand, we have materialism of one variety or another, which usually shows up as debunking in some version or another under the guise of skepticism, but is really an ideological disposition of debunking. Then on the other hand, we have traditions that would take these phenomena in some way as real, but then tend to immediately try to control them and fit them into pre-existing narratives, usually religious or spiritual or kind of theological ones, often, I would argue, with a kind of outdated metaphysics and a lot of metaphysical baggage. And so weird naturalism is an attempt to kind of shoot the gap between that double bind and say that yes, these phenomena are real, though we're not quite sure how they're real. We're not quite sure what reality is, to be honest, and we have to start rethinking our notions of reality in light of these phenomena. And we don't necessarily have to ascribe to them all these fabricated, preset kind of models or narratives around how we think they're real. Weird naturalism wants to emphasize that the weird and the strangeness and the eerie and the uncanny and the anomalous qualities of these experiences are not necessarily just something we haven't solved yet. They're not an obstacle to understanding necessarily. They may well be the very core of the experience itself. And any attempts to too quickly get rid of the weirdness, to get rid of the uncanny and the high strangeness by figuring it out, might actually take us in the wrong direction. So weird naturalism wants to argue that the weird is core to these phenomena. That weird doesn't mean unreal or illusory or delusional, but weird, strange, not necessarily so easily domesticated or controlled within sort of prescripted narratives and ideas that we have, but open us into some numinous and areas of synchronicity. The other piece that weird naturalism does is it criticizes tendencies that are strong in a lot of the spiritualist, metaphysical traditions where these phenomena are seen to come from another order of reality, another plane of reality, that makes them sort of uncriticizable, unjudgeable, and leads to a lot of faith-based, even cultish kinds of things, which is especially strong, as we'll see in the UFO phenomenon. So it's weird naturalism. These experiences are understood to be natural. Things like near-death experiences, contacts, anomalous lights in the sky, synchronicities, precognition. These are part of the natural order. They might be rare. They might be more on the strange side. They're not necessarily everyday occurrences, but they are part of the natural, the real, the normal, however we want to conceive of that. So those are some very simple, basic thoughts on weird naturalism. And again, if you're interested in more on that, there's an earlier reflection of mine that goes into a lot more detail on that. So, weird naturalism and how it relates to the topic at hand here, the UFO and the contact phenomenon. So again, weird naturalism tries to shoot the gap and offer a new way between a kind of a double bind that has controlled the discourse around these subjects. Materialism on the one hand, and a kind of outdated, outmoded spiritual metaphysics on the other. So the first thing weird naturalism wants to do in relationship to the UFO topic is to start criticizing those two positions. So on the materialist side, as it relates to the UFO phenomenon, we have sort of two subgroups. The more dominant one would be the skeptics, the debunkers. So it's all swamp gas. There's just a bunch of weather balloons. It's people thinking they see lights in the sky, but it's really the planet Venus. The whole alien abduction phenomenon is nothing other than a strange consequence of sleep paralysis. It's mass collective psychosis. It's mass anxiety that's been propagated through movies and television, that people's subconscious are creating sort of hallucinatory, delusional experiences, and there's no such thing as any of this. Now, or it's all government cover-up or whatever. So there's all these different attempts to essentially debunk the entire phenomenon. Now, of course, lots of people have claimed to have experiences that actually are not anomalous phenomena, that are conventional phenomena, that they just misunderstood, or people have strange dreams and nighttime encounters, and the mind can play tricks on itself, sure. But to reduce this entire phenomenon and basically claim that anyone who claims to have an experience is essentially mentally ill, which is really what it comes down to, is extremely brutal, number one. It's untrue. It's deeply false. It's ideological. Because whatever else this phenomenon is, it's clearly pointing to consciousness as real. And that undermines the entire philosophy of materialism, which dominates the secular world and dominates our politics and our economics and education and all of the rest. And here's this phenomenon that's not supposed to exist, but it does, that actually undermines the core aspects philosophically of our world. Hence, we just need to push it over in a corner. Everybody who claims to have it is delusional, is mistaken, and, we're done. So weird naturalism wants to undermine that position. It also will undermine and criticize, in some ways, the other form of materialism in the UFO debate, which are the nuts and bolts ufologists. So these are people who think that UFOs are real, whatever real is, but they think of real in strictly materialist, scientific, rational terms. So they get very hyped up about finding a craft. They really are biological entities, manning these craft, and they're really from outer space, and they're physical biological entities. So we want to find an alien corpse and autopsy it. So it's a very odd position, I think, in that you're open to the idea somehow or other that there's beings from other galaxies or dimensions or can go faster than the speed of light or whatever, but everything is still very materialistic. And materialism is really the core, mental philosophy and ontology we should hold. So that's a pretty odd juxtaposition there. So even though the nuts and bolts people and the skeptics spend all their time yelling at each other, they actually both hold the same fundamental underlying philosophical presupposition that reality is defined only by things that you can touch and taste with your five senses, or extensions of our five senses through technological means. And weird naturalism wants to point out that that's really the philosophical flaw. That's the fly in the ointment there. So that's one side of the ledger. The other side of the ledger would be the spiritualist UFO dynamic. So on the plus side, these folks at least agree that the phenomenon is real in some way or another, and that consciousness is real in some way and can't simply be reduced to materialistic presuppositions. But then they immediately start going into what we talked about earlier, is kind of pre-scripted narratives, usually unconscious theological ones, and not necessarily very adept or well-developed theology, to be totally honest. And I say that as someone who studied theology. And they immediately try to frame this phenomenon inside of those narratives. So this would be like ancient aliens, all the stories in the Bible and other traditions of gods and angels are just really aliens. The contactee phenomena that was strong in the 50s, where there are space brothers and sisters who've come down to bring kind of intergalactic peace, love, and harmony. They're basically hippies from outer space. Evangelical Christian fundamentalist types who are big into the rapture and the end times will interpret it all as, demons that are coming to steal people in the night. They're spawns of Satan. UFO cults and religions, the Ascension, ET channel texts, ninth dimensional, whatever, Arcturians or Pleiadians who've come to bring a gospel of intergalactic enlightenment. The abduction lore and narrative, which often takes a lot of anomalous type experiences and tries to funnel them into a pre-designed narrative of abduction, which is questionable in certain cases. There's a whole series of different versions of this phenomenon, but all of them are all attempts to kind of say we know what it is. Whether it's all considered pure love and light or purely demonic, it usually tends to these kind of extreme positions. It claims various kinds of religious or quasi-religious kinds of covers and justifications. And to this, weird naturalism would say, we agree with you, the phenomenon is real, but how it's real, we don't necessarily have to buy into any of these, what are ultimately hypotheses. The extraterrestrial hypothesis is a hypothesis. It's an attempt to make sense of and to frame these series of anomalous and highly strange encounters. And it has some pluses and minuses, arguably, but it is a hypothesis. It doesn't mean you automatically have to believe in aliens and ETs in order to accept that something real is going on. So the debate has been held entirely between either you think it's all a bunch of hooey and it's bunk and it's delusion, or it's aliens from outer space and spacecrafts. And neither position is particularly nuanced or very reflective. And so weird naturalism, again, wants to offer a path through those two, that double bind, and offer us some ways to think a lot more sort of multi-perspectively, if you like, open to a lot more numinous and strangeness and non-linearity inherent in the phenomenon. Because the phenomenon is very slippery and trickstery, and every time we think we got a hold on it, it morphs and it evolves and it flips and it changes and it reveals another dimension that sometimes is even seemingly absurd, and it's hard to impute our human constructs of intentionality or good and evil necessarily don't automatically fit well or cohere well with the nature of the phenomenon. So weird naturalism always wants to emphasize that there's experience, but then there's also interpretation of the experience. And we can strongly adhere to the notion that this experience is real, whatever the heck's going on, but we don't automatically have to buy into all the various hypotheses or narratives or systems of interpretation that have been put out there. So that's just some broad thoughts on weird naturalism in relationship to the UFO phenomenon. A summary version of which would be, as many have pointed out, the U in UFO stands for unidentified. The phenomenon is real, and we really need to take that in, because it's heavy duty. How it's real, what is real, the manner by which it's real is radically mysterious, is unidentified. And there are various attempts and hypotheses put forward to explain the phenomenon, but it's not clear that any of those hypotheses have yet really captured it. Because the phenomenon has so many different qualities and dimensions and aspects that it's hard, I think, for any singular narrative to incorporate all the different seemingly paradoxically aligned or almost on times contradictory aspects of this phenomenon. Like, it includes craft in the sky that violate the known laws of physics, the conventionally publicly taught physics anyway, up to people claiming experiences out of their body and astral traveling in their beds into encounters with strange being and lights, and some are given messages of an apocalyptic nature, of a coming ecological disaster, and they feel they have to come back to Earth to have a mission. Others experience healing, others experience full-on traumatic experiences of some kind of seeming experimentation, and their strange sexual encounters. It covers a vast array of different elements that all somehow link together. And typically within the history of ufology, different schools have only wanted to emphasize certain aspects and leave the other parts out. So they want to be focused on crafts and nuts and bolts, or they want to be into consciousness and ET as angels, but they don't want to talk about abductions, they don't want to talk about materiality and craft and technology. And so the field has been quite splintered as a result. It's been quite fragmented. So the U in UFO stands for unidentified, while nevertheless real, whatever the hell real is. So without claiming that we've figured it out, I do think there are some things that we can point to that would be kind of like tent poles, pegs, we could hang our hats on with some strong degree of certainty, I think. Again, it doesn't mean we know what it is now, but I do think there's some things we can know about it, around it, in relationship to this phenomenon. The first of which is this phenomenon has been going on for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. It's actually an extremely ancient phenomenon that constantly mutates and evolves and shifts and transforms its shape and molds itself in concert and in a strange symbiotic relationship with the evolution of our own consciousness as human beings. So this really has its roots in the great work of Jacques Vallée. Vallée noticed the extremely strange and deep correspondence between lore that we would consider the ET, alien, modern UFO phenomenon, and say the lore concerning the fairy folk in the Celtic tradition, or the jinn in the Near Eastern, pre-Islamic, and later Islamic, like Persia, the Near East tradition, the lore concerning apparitions of the Virgin Mary in the Catholic tradition, as well as numerous others. And not just in some general sense that there's some interesting random points of similarity, but like point by point by point by point, underlying structural similarity replicated throughout cultures across the world through time and space. The abduction phenomenon, for example. There's a tradition known as the Witches' Sabbath, as pointed out by Peter Levenda. And the Witches' Sabbath were women who were claimed to be witches, not necessarily self-identify as such during persecutory periods, but they claimed they were taken out of their bodies, flown at night by demons, Satan, whatever, and then had strange encounters which could and often did involve bizarre sexual / non-consensual, disturbing, traumatic type experiences, and then they were brought back to their beds and left to deal with the consequence of that. Does that sound familiar? On point after point after point, all of the elements that we think of as the modern UFO phenomenon have been happening for thousands upon thousands of years. The fairy folk have changelings, and time people encountered the fairy dance and then would lose senses of time and would lose hours, like people have time loss experiences in the modern UFO phenomenon. Just every core dimension. An individual ascending up a vehicle to encounter a being of light who gives them an apocalyptic message to bring back to Earth is something that's been going on for thousands of years. These beings, whoever they are, seem to be concerned about the end of the world for a long, long time now. So Vallée pointed out that whatever this phenomenon is, it's not something that just started after World War II when people started seeing flying saucers. It's actually been going on throughout history. On the technological side of the phenomenon, as people like Gordon White have pointed out, the phenomenon is really interesting in that it meets us at an existing form of then existing technology as a kind of metaphoric bridge, and then amplifies that technology into a kind of evolutionary leap. So, for example, when the prophet Ezekiel famously sees the chariot of God in the sky with the throne, chariots and thrones were technologies that existed in Ezekiel's day. But then the thing that he sees, or the vehicle, or the experience he has that's quite psychedelic, it's chariot and a throne, but then it's kind of totally tripped out beyond that. In the airship mystery in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, which is the direct antecedent of the UFO phenomenon, there were anomalous aerial vehicles and phenomena that people experienced. and they looked kind of like something out of Jules Verne, basically. They looked kind of steampunk and sort of like zeppelins and balloons and dirigibles and blimps, because those were existing technology, but they were manifestly somehow other while still having enough of a form to look kind of like something that they knew from their world. And then after World War II, of course, with the Maury Island affair and Kenneth Arnold and the squadron of disc-like saucers and Roswell, we have craft technology that look like spaceships, that look like rockets or something, spacecraft, which were a growing technology that started after the end of the Second World War, when the space race started. So again, from a technological point of view, it always meets us in an existing way and then amplifies or accelerates or goes meta and transcends. And from the consciousness side, it similarly involves wild, non-domesticated, transcendental, psychedelic type experiences. Vallée argued that the phenomenon is ultimately a conscious technology. He united the two schools, the consciousness side and the technology, nuts and bolts, materialist side, and said they're actually two sides of one coin. It's a technology that alters consciousness. Whether for good or for ill is kind of open to debate, but whatever it is, the technology alters consciousness, and sort of vice versa, it's probably a technology that requires a certain degree of consciousness in order to express. So again, without reducing the mystery, retaining the unidentified quality of this phenomenon, leaving the mystery and the elusiveness of it open, we can say that it's been going on a long time. It's not a new thing. Second thing we can say about it is that it's one variation, it's one branch of a psychic tree, of a many-branched tree that I would consider the psychic. In other words, within paranormal studies, parapsychology, and things like that, these different subjects tend to be broken up into different boxes and segregated. So you got near-death experiences over here, you got psychedelics and entheogens and ayahuasca and acid and drug trips here, and mushrooms, that kind of thing. You've got psi phenomena, telekinesis, telepathy, precognition here. We got cryptids over here. We got ghosts, hauntings, and specters and poltergeists here, communication with the dead, channeling. We've got UFOs and aliens are over here, remote viewing, astral traveling, out-of-body experiences, lucid dreaming is kind of another category, and they're all treated like they're these neat, cordoned off from each other, little neat segregated boxes. When in reality, they're all totally intermeshed and interwoven to each other. When John Keel famously studied the so-called Mothman phenomenon in West Virginia, which was a monster, anomalous creature, cryptid, whatever, that people claim to encounter. The same region where these encounters were occurring, there were also lights in the sky and what would more classically be termed UFOs. Individuals who had encounters, many of them also then experienced what would normally be considered like poltergeist type phenomena in their lives and in their homes. So is it a poltergeist thing? Is it a UFO thing? Is it a cryptid thing? It's kind of all of them all at once. The Edgar Mitchell Society just completed the first major quantitative and qualitative study of self-identified contactees, experiencers. And the thing that comes through time and time again in their reflections is the extremely strong, high correlation between encounters, so-called UFO or alien or contact encounters, and the massive increase and acceleration of psychic phenomena in that person's experience. Synchronicities, lucid dreaming, precognition, remote viewing, astral traveling. There's a long history of overlap between the psychonauts, folks who take a lot, on entheogenic psychedelic trips, encountering entities that, for all the world, look to be very similar to the ones that people are claiming in abduction or contact experiences. The legends the folklore concerning the fairies and the Huldafolk and the sylphs and dwarves and elves and the jinn often involve overlap between encounters with those beings in realms of the dead. Whitley Strieber, one of the most famous, and in my mind, one of the most important or nuanced reflectors on his experience as a contactee, abductee, experiencer. In his first encounter with what he called the visitors, he never said they were aliens. He just called them the visitors, which is a kind of weird naturalist thing to say. In his first encounter, he experienced at the same time what we would think of as aliens. A person he knew from his life, who then he later found out had been dead for some months. And his wife, Anne, was really the first to point out that whatever this phenomenon is, it has really deep overlap with the traditions of near-death experiences and communication with the dead, which makes it even weirder than we normally think. So again, it's been going on a long time. It keeps changing and morphing in certain ways, and yet there's deep structural similarity, replicating. It remains anomalous and unidentified, and yet its impacts have to do with the psychic, principally. And the psychic, as Integral defines it, is the mystical encounter with materiality, with the gross material realm, with the waking state. Which is why it has connections to things like elementals and fairies and the jinn, for example. It's very interesting, the lore concerning them. In the Quran, the jinn are described not as human, but also not as angels or demons. So there's kind of one category of angels. There's another category called human, and then there's this weird third intermediate category called the jinn. And the jinn are said to be beings of smokeless fire, which is really interesting when we start to... There's like a material element, but then it's simultaneously not material because it's fire, but there's no smoke. Just like the craft in the sky that militaries have encountered for a long, long period of time, blip in and out of radar. They make right turns at ways that they shouldn't be able to do in midair. They do forms of propulsion that are against the known force of gravity. So they're material, but they're sort of not material. And the same with encounters with the so-called entity or consciousness side. So in integral theory, the integral theory states that the psychic as a state is ever present. It's the mystical encounter of Earth and the stars, and is classically understood to be animism. But then states, altered states or higher states of consciousness, are then manifest and embedded through structures of consciousness. So if you get the psychic state with a magical structure of consciousness, that's probably how we get fairies and jinn and elementals and so forth. The psychic state mixed with the mythic structure of consciousness gives us the aliens are all angels, these beings are all demons, it's all part of a war in heaven, it's a great mythological story about the apocalypse, the ascension, the new earth, the whatever, intergalactic universal brotherhood. The psychic state mapped and embedded through the mental rational structure of consciousness gives us things like Project Stargate, the CIA spending millions of dollars to study how to weaponize psychic phenomenon, how to train spies in remote viewing, how to use LSD and drugs to change people's consciousness and alter their minds and control their minds even. So what we're experiencing now, I would argue, is the breakdown of the mental rational structure of consciousness, is what Jean Gebser argued, that we're in the late phase, the late stage, the deficient phase of the mental rational structure of consciousness. And the third main point then I think we can say about this phenomenon without yet saying we know what it is that whatever else it is, it's alchemical and it's initiatory. It's an evolutionary pressure. This is the argument of Whitley Strieber, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote the first major kind of bestseller that we now think of in kind of the abduction, kind of contact, memoir tradition. And Strieber has this very enigmatic, but I think very powerful statement, which is, whatever this phenomenon is, it's the force of evolution upon a conscious human mind. Which isn't to say it's necessarily all good, nor that it's necessarily all evil. It's what Strieber calls a stress, an inducement of stress. Or we would probably use the language now of trauma. And this would be true of both the kind that are considered positive or the ones that are considered negative according to our standards. So people who have these kind of lights in the sky and they have this kind of doe-eyed, deer in headlights kind of thing is a freeze state from a trauma point of view, just as much as people who have the abduction and the feelings of being experimented upon and having kind of fight and flight energies. So whatever else it is, it's inducing stress. It's a traumatic, and Strieber would argue, shamanically initiatory type experience, which I think at this point millions of human beings, certainly thousands upon thousands and probably millions, have had experiences. Most, of course, will never talk about it for fear of social ostracism and for fear of being labeled crazy. And then others do, but then they can easily get hooked into problematic political and social agendas, whether in the intelligence apparatus or in cults and strange religious traditions and support groups that become problematic from an interpersonal dynamic and play and prey upon people's experiences and have kind of like New Age fundamentalism and all the weirdness that goes on there. So if it's alchemical, if it's the psychic state trying to manifest itself as a structure of consciousness, then this would line up with an idea that Ken Wilber floated in his recent book, The Religion of Tomorrow, where he hypothesizes or postulates a possible structure of consciousness beyond rationality. And he imagines it or hypothesizes that its first form, its first expression, would be the psychic state as a structure of consciousness. And the psychic state historically has to do with connections with the dead, with ancestors, with the spirit of places, maybe through drugs or altered states of one variety or another, shamanic journeying, which we now think of as astral traveling or remote viewing, near-death experiences. So again, they all come back in this same way, pointing time and time again to this form. In integral theory, there's of course the four quadrants, that for a structure, for an embedding of reality, it has a consciousness side, it has a materiality side, it has a interrelational, communicative, interpretive side, and it has a social and technological, ecological, political expression. And so therefore the UFO phenomenon, whatever else it is not actually, I would argue, this weird sideline kooky thing that some people are into, but is actually like core, maybe one of, if not the core topics currently going on in the world. Easily one of the most important, if not the most important phenomenon currently happening. Why is that? As Richard Dolan pointed out in his great books on the UFO and the national security state, the UFO phenomenon is the hidden, occulted, hidden driving force in the development of the national security state in the Cold War. And from there, from the national security state, we of course get the national surveillance state that we're living under. So the UFO is the core, hidden motivator and driver of the development of the intelligence agencies and the security apparatus and the military-industrial complex and everything that's come from that. Catherine Austin Fitts and Joseph Farrell have extended Dolan's point and argued persuasively, in my view, that the UFO phenomenon is actually the core, hidden, motivating, driving force of the development of the global black economy, off-books economy, which is kind of sucking the life out of the above-ground productive economy into what people call the missing trillions, but they're not really missing. It's actually the siphoning off of productive wealth to develop essentially space colonization. And we've seen edges of that with announcements like Elon Musk and Richard Branson want to do space tours to the moon, and President Trump wants to create a space army, space force, which a lot of people laughed at and mocked and thought it was absurd. But when you really think underneath the story, why would you need an army in space? Because you have a corporate colonization project going on, and you need to prevent against what Senator Ted Cruz called us space pirates. Again, he got made fun of, but you can actually see the point. As Richard Dolan also pointed out, think about the UFO phenomenon and its ability to make the most advanced U.S. Military fighter jets look like something the Wright brothers made. This occurred in the so-called Tic Tac video that the U.S. Navy admitted was an actual video of a UFO, which is pretty amazing that they admitted that. And it did maneuvers, and it outflew, and it was hypersonic, and it could do anti-gravitic stuff, and it could flip in and out, and appear and disappear and reappear. And it makes, our jets, like I said, look like something the Wright brothers were up to. What is the energy source behind that technology, that conscious technology? As Richard Dolan pointed out, whatever it is, they're not filling up at the gas station. So right there you have possibilities around the climate crisis and the energy crisis and the multiple crises that we're experiencing. We've got geopolitics, we've got economics, all of which are pointing to a whole other reality that is currently occurring, and it manifests an entirely different form of consciousness, technology, probably energy, and potentially even relationality and communication. People always claim in their experiences that it's telepathically communicated, whatever is communicated, plus, minus, or indifferent. If it's an initiatory process, if it's essentially a shamanic ordeal on a collective scale. And again, there's very interesting overlaps, like Graham Hancock has pointed out, there's very interesting overlaps between classic shamanic images of being dismembered and cut open by beings and then put back together, as well as the abduction phenomenon. So if it's an initiatory phenomenon, initiations classically happen according to 3 stages. Stage 1, the traumatizing initial encounter that rips one from the mundane, conventional, regularly ordered world and takes one into the realm of the high strange and the wild and the mystical. And many, many people are having that experience and can't talk about it. Stage 2, in a classic ordeal or initiatory model, is a period of what's called disorientation. The individual is ripped from their old context and container, and then they're sent out into a kind of a wilderness or a liminal space, and they have to reform themselves psychically. They have to reorder and reform their view of the world in light of what's occurred. And ideally, they come to a place of new power. They transform through the alchemical burn, through the crucible of the encounter, and are changed. And then stage 3 is, having transformed, they return to the village or the tribe, are recognized as such, and are welcomed back and are given affirmation of their changed nature. So thousands upon thousands and potentially millions of human beings are having these anomalous encounters. They have basically no way to talk about it while seeming sane, much less a very skilled therapeutic context necessarily to deal with it. They aren't necessarily completing the initiation through phase 2, and there's no way in hell that they're coming back into a community of the adequate, as Integral would call it, to be recognized as a transformed being. In classic or traditional initiatory models or experiences, think like a tribe that takes the young boys away at puberty and puts them through their shamanic initiation, their ordeal, and then they come back and they're men, and the boys are dead, and now they're a man in the eyes of the tribe. Think about a boy who fails his initiation in that context. It's a terrible place to be, because he's no longer a boy. His boyhood has been killed, metaphorically, in the encounter, in the initiatory encounter. But he didn't get through to the place of adulthood. And so he is left in this weird space where he's a kind of a undead creature, where he's alive, but he's not alive, and he's kind of dead, but he's not dead. And he sort of subsists rather than he exists. And that, unfortunately, I find is where a lot of people are stuck, because we aren't able to talk about this in a rational way, because we're still having this essentially juvenile debate about is it real or is it not real. Instead of getting to the real action, the real question is, how the hell is it real? What is real? And what do we do with this? Because it is going on. It's going on all the time. So if it's a psychic phenomenon principally, as I think we can argue that it might well be, whatever else that is, and whatever else that might imply, it does mean, I think, that we can say that we know the tools that we can actually bring to bear to help people heal and transform. Even if that doesn't mean we figure out what it is, and there's all kinds of other stuff about militaries and craft and future tech and all of that, but just at the level of experiencers. The tools that we can bring to bear, if it's a psychic phenomena, are number 1, tools of trauma and nervous system re-regulation. Things like somatic experiencing and a lot of the work that's been done on trauma literacy, especially in the last 20, 30 years. Because as John Mack said, the great psychologist who was the first one to really take seriously the abduction phenomenon, he said, whatever else is going on with these people, and he didn't claim that he knew. He just said they're showing signs of traumatic stress disorder. They're showing signs of PTSD. The ones who claim particularly, typically, abduction, so-called abduction experiences. And he just said, they're showing me trauma signs. In a weird naturalist point of view, we allow these things to be real and not real simultaneously. everything is along a spectrum, what the great Charles Fort called an intermediate kind of spectrum of real and unreal simultaneously. So it's real enough as a psychic encounter, whatever else it may or may not be in terms of reality. And therefore it can be treated as such, particularly if it's of a traumatic initiatory type dynamic, like Strieber argued. It was certainly for him and for many that he talked to in terms of their experiences. We can also bring the tools of the psychic tradition, which are classically labeled under animism or shamanism, as ways to deal with this encounter. The phenomenon changes to the degree that we change in relationship to it. Strieber was raised Catholic, so he called his book Communion. And I was raised Catholic, so I get that. It has a Catholic sacramental tone to it. If we were going to use an Eastern term, we might almost say something like, whoever they are and whoever we are, we have karma with each other. So it is helpful, and it's even fun in a way to have these kind of wild debates about, are they from other planets? Is it AI from the future? Did we create the AI and now it's come back from the future? Did someone else create the AI? Are they from parallel lifetimes and the multiverse? Is it from other dimensions or wormholes, and they can, wrinkle in time and jump through wormholes and cross life streams of the multiverse? Are they us from the future? Are they us from the realm of the dead? Are they totally other? Are we somehow inextricably linked to each other? It's really important to keep the weirdness open, but also practically and pragmatically it's important so that people can hear that the weirdness notwithstanding, these are natural experiences. And they may well have an initiatory or accelerative function, or at least can, in people's experiences if they're dealt with appropriately, and then we can have a container and a context to do that in a way that is sane, compassionate, wise, thoughtful, as opposed to lots of the stuff that's going on under the guise of trying to help people but can actually be really hurting. We don't know who we are, we don't know who they are, but our encounter somehow, I think, Strieber is very interesting in this regard, in that he has moments where he thinks the encounter is trying to teach us who we are, but also might be trying to teach them who they are. This is, again, this notion that maybe we have karma with each other, whatever that means. We've been relating, whoever they are, whoever we are, for thousands upon thousands of years in highly strange ways. And we continue to do so, and I think it's accelerating. It's not slowing down as our mental rational structure of consciousness continues to deteriorate, and we see the loss of trust in institutions and religion and government and politics and economics, and all these things are kind of crumbling. There's an evolutionary push. There's a crisis that's occurring that's trying to be alchemical and be a crucible to bring us into a greater degree of maturation. But that initiation is not a predestined automatic guarantee. And failed initiations, like I mentioned earlier, don't go well. And until we start really taking this phenomenon seriously, and not get caught in all these, like I said, juvenile debates about is it real, is it not real, or it's real, but then we turn it into some foo-foo, woo-woo, new age nonsense. Until we get really sober and real about this thing, people are going to continue to suffer. And maybe the phenomenon is going to have to keep trying to knock on the door in ways that are not necessarily the way we want to have happen. So those are some thoughts. I hope those are helpful. Again, my thanks to Bruce for hosting, and to the other conversational partners in this roundtable. It's a real honor to be part of this discussion, and I hope everyone finds some use in this. All the best. Bye for now.